really valuable that an event like this today about partnership, actually we center the discussion on people and thinking about people, because quite often the people element, whether we're dealing with influencers, whether we're dealing with our colleagues, whether we're trying to compete in a really competitive space, the people element often gets overlooked. So I'm going to give you some really clear practical tips. The people element getting overlooked is really at the heart of this. This is a tweet I saw. I always love this tweet because it reminds us the people element is quite important. This tweet says, the feeling when you realize the robots will steal your job. Should have sound on it, that one. Okay, so okay, not a person, a cat. I recognise that's a cat shaming thing, but just a reminder that putting people at the heart of our discussions is quite powerful. Here's why this started with me, because I worked for a long time in technology companies. At one stage, we had one of those very familiar things where burnout levels were really high. We actually had a situation where market situations meant we had to do a round of job cuts, and we struggled actually to reignite the culture after that. There's something that happens when you've done a round of job cuts, trust is breached a bit, and I sat there as a boss, as a leader, thinking, right, what can I do to reignite it? So I'm going to give you some of the pointers that I learned about, but there are two things that, irrespective of whether we're talking about work or any other circumstance, there are two things that make us happier, full stop. So the number one thing, I'm going to give you these for free before we even get onto the content. The number one thing that will make you happier in life, if you're not feeling very happy, number one thing is to get more sleep. And the research on this is fascinating. An intervention of Prozac, if you're depressed, is regarded, Prozac and cognitive behavioral therapy are regarded as the best things clinically to do if you're depressed. They will move you on average about 6 points on the depression scale. A good night's sleep moves you 8 points on that scale. So more sleep is probably the best thing. But my favorite thing about that, there was some research done into people who said they didn't need much sleep. And sleep scientists in New York invited 100 of these light sleepers in to have their brain scanned, because they thought maybe their brains were different. And what they found was about 80% of them fell asleep in the brain scanner. So people who tell you they don't need sleep are kidding you. The number two way to be happier, and this is always an awkward one because it's got consequences. The number two way to be happier is to get happier friends. And I don't know whether you sort of recognise this. This is a complicated one because we don't want to abandon our unhappy friends, but understanding that spending time around happy people is going to benefit everyone there. My mum saw this as drains and radiators. Do you remember that? Did you see that? Drains are those people that maybe they're colleagues, maybe they're friends. They're often they've got a dry, sarcastic humour, but they often see the worst in things. And radiators are those people that you want to go over and chat to them. And there seems to be good evidence that spending more time with the radiators is good for us. So those are the two things that will work, full stop. Before I get into the things that talk about work, I'm going to give you some context. So here's the context of where work is right now. Number one thing is that workplace culture feels more fragmented than ever. A lot of people feel that their workplace dynamic isn't quite right, and I'll give you some data on that. The number two is that flexibility at work has been the most popular change in the history of work. Let me express the same thing in a different way. 2/3 of chief execs, this was a KPMG survey about 12 months ago, 2/3 of chief execs believe we're going to end up back in the office 4 or 5 days a week. They feel it's not working. This is an experiment we don't want to do. 90% of workers say you're not going to make me go back to that. And so we've got this sort of conflict that you might have had, and depending on what your organisation has, you might have had the boss saying, we need to do a return to office push. We need the team in the office a bit more. You might have witnessed things like that. That sort of is a reflection that this boss is feeling that workplace culture doesn't feel the same. Now, it's worth saying that there are little bits of evidence along the way that would support that, but I'm going to suggest that maybe the conclusion is the wrong one. There's an article, if you do get my link at the end, you'll read this article. The article, it was in the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago, called The Loneliness of the American Worker. Now, I recognise it was an American worker, but the thing it spoke about is something that we see in the UK data. 40% of British workers say they don't have a single friend at work. Now, the interesting thing about that, I think if you saw that article, your boss, for example, might say, I know what the cause of that is. I know why people are lonely at work. The really interesting thing, actually, is if you delved into it, it wasn't necessarily what you'd presume. The loneliness was identical for people who were in the office 5 days a week. The loneliness was identical for people who were fully remote. The loneliness was identical for hybrid workers. Where people worked wasn't the issue. There is something about the way we're working that seems to be creating something that is a degree more isolated. Gallup does a workplace survey, and I think if we want to see the challenge that we've got, this gives us some pointers. Gallup survey, I've picked 3 of the data points that came out in the new version that came out about 15 days ago. 7% of British workers say they feel sad on a daily basis. 10% of British workers say they're engaged in their job. And about 38% of people say they feel stress all day, every day. So it's a pretty bleak scenario. If you work in an international company, you can download that report and have a look specifically at different countries. My favorite part is that there's part of me that feels really embarrassed when I see the 10% engaged figure. 10% of British workers are engaged in their job. And the only thing that makes me less embarrassed is that it's not the lowest. 3% of Italians are engaged with their job. 3% of French people. And my favorite thing is, whenever I meet someone who's Italian or French, and I say to them, how do you feel about 3% of Italians being engaged with their job? They always say to me, without hesitation, they always say, sounds about right. It's like a really intriguing position. What does it mean, engaged? It means that you feel like you can have an impact in your job. You feel excited about what you can get done in your job. If we can get this part right, it makes work more engaged, more motivating for us, but it also has an impact on productivity, on profitability, on customer happiness. It also reduces things like workplace sickness, workplace theft. So getting this thing right seems to be really critical. So I'm going to give you 4 specific ways. And in fact, there's going to be more tips along the way, but I'm going to give you 4 specific components that if you've got any input at all into how your organization functions, what your organization feels like, these things seem to have the biggest impact. Number 1 is trust. Foundational in any environment. This might be when you're dealing with an influencer. This might be when you're dealing with colleagues or with a partner company. But the more that we can build trust, self-evidently, it plays a huge part. What you'll identify is that it's very difficult to build any of the other parts that I'm going to talk about without trust. Now, quite often in workplace jargon, trust is sort of styled as psychological safety. I think it's broadly synonymous. Psychological safety is our ability to speak candidly to each other without fear of consequence. So, thinking about partners, there might be people that you can be very direct with. There might be people that you can express concerns and anxieties about. And there's also people who, there's certain things you can't say. And what we know is that the more we're able to build that psychologically safe environment, the better the work is. I'll give you the reason why I show a hospital bed here. The woman who first did the research on this actually explored and found most of the insight through hospitals. So what she found is that she was able to track the performance of different teams via asking them questions and surveys. So one of the things she found that was most predictive was asking people, do you feel confident in the work done here? Do you feel confident in your teammates' abilities? That seemed to be a really good predictor of the work that was done. She added a bit more data, and one of the things she added was the amount of times they were giving the wrong medicine to someone, drug errors. And she was convinced, well, everything else tells me that these are the best teams. I'm sure they'll be making the fewest errors. Actually, she found something very different. The best teams were making significantly more errors than the worst teams. Really interestingly, the very best teams were making about twice as many drug errors as the average teams. Really intrigued. She went back and she was on the verge of scrapping her research, and she went back and she chatted to people, and she realized there was a nuance. The best teams weren't necessarily making the most mistakes. The best teams were admitting to making the most mistakes. Because when you've got no consequence of making an error, people don't think I'm going to fire you for that, people start being more candid about, I found that really difficult. Sorry, I did this wrong. And that's psychological safety, that acceptance of failure, but with good intention, that acceptance that sometimes people will speak up and raise concerns. That seems to be the basis of all trusting environment. The really critical thing is that psychological safety is much easier to destroy than it is to create. And you might have witnessed that with yourself. You might have certain times that you've told someone something and they not only didn't want to hear it, but maybe they judged you for raising it. So if any of us can contribute to psychologically safe environments, it seems to be foundational for building the best research. The more you can say with anyone that you're working with, can we be honest with each other? Can we talk about the things we're not talking about? It seems to be foundational in terms of building good culture. Let's go on. Next one might seem abstract. It's the notion of control. And by that, I mean, if we feel in control of the situation that we find ourselves in. Specifically, what we find is that the biggest predictor, bar none, of our well-being is a sense of autonomy, a sense of agency, a sense that we can have an impact on things. So you might witness this financially. If your rent payment, your mortgage payment is out of your control, actually it can be a really big predictor of your stress levels. Or you might find yourself in a work environment where you open your calendar, you've got back-to-back meetings all day, and you just find yourself with that sort of breathlessness, anxiety that, how am I meant to get my work done? They've just had one break all day and someone's dropped a meeting over it. And what we broadly find is that the more agency people feel in their life, the more autonomy they feel, the more liberated and energized they are. And so actually understanding that is a really critical component. Understanding that people, if they feel like they've got the scope to get something done, it can be energizing for them. It can be a really important insight. If someone feels overwhelmed, actually one of the best things to do is to demonstrate to them where they do have control. And that might not be in all parts, especially if you're dealing with clients, with partners, then recognizing what you can't control is often the first step to controlling everything else. But that's why I say, when we're thinking about how work has changed in the last few years, and your boss is thinking, well, I want them back in the office, it's missing something that is having a far bigger impact. And that is the fact that in the last 10 years, the amount of time we spend in meetings has trebled. In fact, it's more than doubled since the pandemic. It's gone up by about 2.5 times. So when your boss is saying things don't feel the same, what they're missing is that there's something fundamental that has transformed in the way we work. And it's the sort of thing that really has an impact on our sense of freedom, our sense that we're able to have an impact. Transforming these things is really critical. You might witnessed your boss might tell people to get into the office, and then you hear people say, I traveled all the way into the office to sit on Teams calls all day. And they say, I just don't feel that that's a good use of my money, a good use of my time. And these watercolor moments you keep promising to me, there's no sight of them. I'm just sitting at my desk with headphones on. I think it's a really important consideration. If we understand that autonomy is liberating, then actually enabling people to work in the way that's right for them, while recognizing there are some benefits from when we are together, is a really important consideration. One thing we know about that when we're feeling about thinking about our own personal dynamics or about team dynamics, it's a really critical understanding. And that is, culture often exists in the gaps between things. There's beautiful insight into this. We get lovely examples when we study teams. And what we find is that the teams who are back-to-back, are heavily scheduled, maybe don't get much chance to interact with each other, they tend to have much worse culture. They tend to lose sight of why they're doing something. Purpose seems to be a distant prospect. The teams, strangely, who just take a moment to maybe have a little bit in their less in their diaries, but interact with each other more, speak in a far healthier state. Really lovely work studying, comparing railway workers and warehouse workers. I recognise for most of us, they seem a long way from where we're doing our jobs. But interestingly, if you explore those people, the big difference between railway workers is that they often sit down and have lunch together. They often sit down and have a cup of coffee together in the morning, a cup of tea together in the afternoon. And weirdly, when you look at them, they speak far more glowingly about feeling connected to their jobs, feeling like their mission is to keep the railway safe. than if you chat to the warehouse workers who feel isolated, atomized. They feel abandoned at work. And actually, it gives us an insight. Because when that Wall Street Journal's article talked about the loneliness of the American worker, actually what it's saying is there's no scope for connection left in our jobs. There's no moment for us to feel like we are doing a job on a personal level. If anyone's ever interested in workplace culture, I adore the work of this woman. This book here, if you follow the link afterwards, you'll see it. But the book's called The Case for Good Jobs, and it's by a Turkish-American researcher called Zeynep Tan. And she gives a really interesting insight into why having a good culture is way more profitable. It grows a business more. And she's got 4 simple principles, but one of them is having slack in the system. With a small s, but having some sort of spare capacity in the system. And she says specifically, if someone goes off sick and your business is then at breaking point, probably your culture isn't going to be in a bad place and your business isn't going to be in a good place. Having slack in the system, having scope for gaps between things is a really critical consideration. It also has another impact. If any of us are sort of thinking about ideas and creativity, it's worth reminding ourselves where creativity lives. If I was doing sort of a really introductory session on neuroscience here, I would suggest to you there's really good evidence that creativity and imagination lives in the gaps between things. So if we did rudimentary neuroscience, there's broadly 3 systems of cognition in the brain. The first one is called the executive attention network. That's sort of what your brain controls. If you're playing a video game, if you're watching a TV show, if you're reading a book, the executive attention network runs that. Then there's a system called the salience network. So while you're playing that video game, while you're watching TV, the salience network just understands where you are and what's happening around you. And there's a third network, and I love understanding this, because if you think of how consumer electronics have changed in the last 20 years, that's how brain scanning has changed. And brain scanning was only any level of sophistication around the millennium. So it's really new science. And what they discovered when they were sort of developing the first proper brain scanners is they realized that this network that they often talked about, this system of cognition called the default network, was a real surprise. The default network used to be regarded as when your brain went into a unused state. It's like when you're not doing something, when the executive attention network isn't doing something, the default network kicks in. But when they loaded people into brain scanners, they noticed that rather than their brains stopping being active then, their brains lit up with loads of activity. So they said to people, what's happening right now? What are you doing? And people would say, they would use 1 or 2 words. They would say, I'm daydreaming. Or they would say, does anyone remember this word? I'm bored. Do you remember being bored as a kid? Do you remember the hours of boredom that you had as a kid? And how we've kind of eliminated that. But the really interesting thing is this default mode, this default network of the brain, that boredom, that daydreaming. When we ask people when they had their best ideas, they often say, oh, I was staring out the window and something came to me. I was on the tube home and I'd forgotten my headphones, so I was just staring at the wall. I was on a plane looking out the window. The default network. My favorite example of it is an American screenwriter, hence the image of the shower here. There's an American screenwriter called Aaron Sorkin, and he's written at least a dozen things that you've seen, the Social Network film or The West Wing. He's written so many things. And Aaron Sorkin says, because his job is dialogue, writing sort of witty, zingy dialogue between people, he realized he was having his best ideas, not when he was sitting at his laptop, but in the shower. So he told an interviewer for Hollywood Reporter magazine, he has 6 to 8 showers a day. And they said to him, can we really get the truth behind this? Is this like an OCD thing? He said, no, it's the only time good ideas come to me, because it's the only time I'm not putting stimulus into my head. So actually understanding that culture lives in the gaps and imagination lives in the gaps, I think is really vital. If you're the sort of person who goes on holiday and has your best ideas, your brain is trying to tell you something. Right, so what's the consequence of that? Well, thinking about reducing meeting time is really critical. And I'll just show you a couple of examples here. Most of us think this is impossible, but a few organizations have said, maybe what we do is we introduce meeting-free Wednesday. Everyone comes into the office that day and we just have meeting-free Wednesday. If we've got to do client stuff, we do client stuff, but meeting-free Wednesday. And the organizations who did it, you'll get this far better if you look at the slides afterwards. The people who did it found that engagement went up, stress levels went down, people's sense of satisfaction with their job transformed. In fact, the only thing better than one meeting-free day was the organizations that introduced 2 meeting-free days. The idea that freeing up meeting time actually doesn't make you less productive, it seems to liberate something in us. If you can't do that, here's another alternative. Do it on a personal level. So monk mode, setting aside an hour for you to have no interruptions, turn all your notifications off on your phone, can often be one of the most satisfying ways to feel like we're making progress in our jobs. Basically you're putting in a meeting with yourself, but turning off your notifications for that hour seems to be one of the most effective ways to feel like, wow, that project that I was meant to be working on for ages has finally got something done. Let me give you another couple of pointers. Next is about respect, and this is about identity more than anything. Feeling like our identity at work is respected and understood by the people around us. I'm going to show you 2 things now that I feel are massively vital for understanding making work better. First one is the idea of feeling understood by our boss. If we look at the way that we work, the workforce survey, the Gallup workforce survey I talked about before, gives us a couple of pointers into this. Firstly, it says that 70% of a worker's engagement comes directly from their manager. If their manager's engaged, 70% likelihood that they will be engaged. But when we look at people who are engaged in their job, 80% of them, 4 out of 5 of them say they've had direct feedback from their boss this week. The boss has seen who they are, seen what they're doing, and their engagement frequently comes from that. Feeling understood and respected for the job we're doing is really vital. It kind of feeds into the final thing that I'm going to really dwell on now, which is the importance of connection. The reason why this matters is it feels so trivial. Whatever role you play inside your organization, I suspect no one would ever put up a slide when you're doing your strategic document for the year, the plan for the year, talking about the next thing. But the biggest predictor of whether the people who work with you and for you are engaged with their job is this. Do they have a best friend at work? Do you have a best friend at work? Some people get scared about the word best. They're like, oh God, I haven't had a best friend since I was 6. Okay, for all those men, let's get rid of the word best and let's just say, do you have a friend at work? The reason why it matters, I think, is because it turns work from being a transaction into being something collegiate, affiliative. I'll show you this. To understand that, and actually the management thing, I love this quotation. Now, I should give you a trigger warning. Apologies if anyone doesn't want to see this, but I'm going to show you some poetry. So I saw this, which is the poet David Whyte said this when he talked about friendship. He said, friendship is the privilege of having been seen by someone and the equal privilege of having been granted the sight of the essence of another. A bit flowery, but I think you get something from that because you also get it about the manager thing as well, right? When people feel seen and understood, when they feel like they can be themselves, when they feel like they can moan about a client, an influencer, a colleague, a boss, when they feel like they can unburden themselves, it turns work into a human experience. And what we know is that actually we get really strong insight into this. We get strong insight into that. If any of us are going to feel our best version of ourselves, social connectedness plays a really big part. Lovely bit of work by a social scientist in the US. He said social connectedness is one of the most important determinants of our well-being. It's a great Netflix show just before Christmas called The Secrets of the Blue Zones, Living to 100. That show said if you've got a good friendship set, you generally extend your lifespan by 15 years. Weirdly, it's the biggest predictor. Having a good friendship group is the biggest predictor of our overall health and well-being. It's weird. We would never be asked about it by a doctor, but it can't be underestimated. And it goes for our jobs as well. When we feel connected, understood, supported, it plays a really fundamental part. It's why all good cultures generally have this sense that we're all in it together about them. So I mentioned those railway workers. Well, those railway workers sitting down, what they inexplicably discovered, they stumbled into, is good culture and good working is about shared moments. I saw this lovely expression of this. There was someone who used to do. I listen to Radio 4 in the mornings. I don't know if you listen to it. I do it because I try and feel like a grown-up. And I put the news on. It lasts about half an hour every day. But every day, inexplicably, at 7:45, they have a vicar come on and give thought for the day. And it's like the bit where I skip that bit forwards to not listen. But there was one person who was good at it. The former chief rabbi of the UK was a guy called Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And he was asked about culture. And the reason why I loved his contributions, he was like this philosopher king. He didn't talk about religion. And he was asked about culture. And he said, where does culture come from? And he used this word here, Simcha. Simcha is the way that. And he said, Simcha is translated as joy. But what it means is shared joy. And he said, culture is about moments of shared joy. And I think we often underestimate it, but the more that we can feel connected to others, we can feel part of something, feel like we're all in it together, plays a fundamental part. So what does that mean then? Well, back to where we were before. It doesn't necessarily mean that your boss needs everyone back in the office 5 days a week or 4 days a week, but trying to treat together time as a little bit different is helpful. Really interesting evidence in that Gallup research that suggests that often teams that are in a good state take time once a month to have lunch together or sit together or have coffee together. Or it might be that you think about those meeting-free days. So starting with people, I think, is really fundamental. Because what we know is that as we graduate forwards, artificial intelligence, machine learning are going to play a bigger and bigger part. Getting the people thing right isn't a nice to have, it's a critical part. So what would I say? Well, look, get more sleep. Reduce meeting time. If you can't do that, monk modes, setting time aside for yourself is really fundamental because it gives you that autonomy. Culture is about shared moments, so together time is special. And if I advise you one thing that you should do, focus on getting a friend at work. Very grateful. Like I say, my slides are at tinyurl.com /IPXBruce. We can get them there. Thank you very much.